This is in someone's yard. If you go up, there's a road here. If you go up this road, you'll see a sign where, excuse me, I'm sorry, this is where the breastworks were. That's right near that parking lot. This is the sign on a person's yard where Port and Clinton went and tried to get around on the flanking movement. Right in their yard is a sign that marks that this was the path they were taking to try and outflank the enemy. And this is another close-up of that same sign. So today from Newtown Battlefield, you look down and this is what you see down in the valley. So down in here is where the battle happened, not actually up where the monument is. As a result of the Battle of Newtown, Tory Indian losses were 12 killed, including a woman who they found dead after the battle. 8 more were killed in pursuit and 9 were wounded. Actually, the casualties might have been higher than that because the Indians often took their casualties with them. They weren't able to get a very accurate count of how many. American losses were 8 killed, 4 were wounded, some died afterwards. 1 man died because he had a leg amputated and he bled to death. And there were 33 who were wounded. So it wasn't a really huge battle, but it was the Battle of Newtown. Right near the site of the battlefield today, there's a small little cemetery that's just off the road. A lot of people don't know it's even there. But if you go in that cemetery, you'll find this tombstone. And the funny thing is there's nobody buried under it because the tombstone was moved. It used to be across the road on someone's private property, so the people that this is commemorating are actually buried over there on someone's private property, not in the cemetery. They moved the stone here because see these pockmarks? People were shooting at it and defacing it. So when the settlers came in later on, they shot this stone up because they didn't like that these guys were the enemy. So they moved the stone just to save and preserve it. Some atrocities happened on both sides during the Sullivan Clinton campaign. This is one that happened after the Battle of Newtown. These guys went out looking for some dead Native Americans, and they skinned some of them from their hips down to make boot leggings, which you wore underneath your boots so your boots didn't chafe against your skin. They used actual human skin to do that. This is the first monument at Newtown. It was put up in 1879, a centennial celebration of the Battle of Newtown. This is it some years later. Not in very good condition. These 2 guys up here are idiots. They're ready to fall any second, and they're standing on top of it, aren't they? So that was taken down, and in 1912 they put up this monument, which you'll still see up there today. Can't climb up that one. So the Army destroyed the Delaware town that was at Newtown. They called it Newtown because it looked like some new buildings that were just being built. So they destroyed that village, burned all the crops. They described corn being 16 feet high in this village. So the agriculture they're seeing by these Native Americans is pretty incredible, better than theirs. And so they're calling these guys savages, but they're finding that these savages actually sometimes live better than they did. The wounded and sick were sent back to Fort Sullivan along with some heavy pieces of artillery. They realized they're just too heavy to take with them on this trip. Sullivan's worried about his rations. He doesn't think he has enough to feed his army. So he calls his soldiers together and offers them a deal. He says, if you can supplement your diet with all the stuff we're finding in these Indian towns, all this corn and beans and squash, and then we can give you half rations instead, would you guys vote in favor of that? And they all were happy to do that because they realized that if they took half rations, they also were eligible for more money to be paid to them because they're accepting half rations. So they all voted in favor of doing this, and they're going to eat this Indian food that they find along the way. Now they leave Newtown and they head towards Elmira, and they find a small village called Kanawhala, which is right along the river in Elmira. This is Water Street in Elmira right now. There's a little sign on Water Street, if you take that exit in Elmira, that tells you that this was where Sullivan's army encamped. And in this town they found some Indian homes that had glass windows in them, wooden floors, feather beds, and nice furniture. And these guys are realizing they're living better than we are. And we're calling these guys savages. So at Kanawhala, they burn all the houses there, including the feather beds, and destroy the furniture they found. Next, they move up through Horseheads. And this campaign is what actually gives Horseheads its name, as we'll talk about later. But a lot of this ground is very, very swampy. So you see right here a very big swamp that had to go through to get to Catherinestown, which is where the British and the Indians went after the Battle of Newtown. They fled to Catherinestown in Montour Falls. So the travel through the swamp was very, very difficult. In fact, if you read the diaries of these guys, a lot of these officers wrote diaries of what happened to them on the Sullivan Clinton campaign. You can buy copies of these or find them in libraries and read them. It's really interesting reading. These guys all knew they were doing something kind of historic, so they wanted to record it. But almost all of them say that this journey through the swamp was one of the worst parts of the whole trip of the Sullivan Clinton campaign. It was just miserable to get through this swamp. They finally reach Catherinestown at dusk on September 1st and find the town empty. There's a bunch of dogs howling. There's food that's still warm, but almost everybody's pretty much gone. There's just no one there, except for one old woman that they found. And they said she looked to be about 100 years old. She was too old to get in a horse and follow everybody else. And she was scared to death what was going to happen to her. But Sullivan took pity on her and gave her a note that she was to be left unharmed. He even gave her some of the provisions, which the soldiers didn't like very much. But he left her a hut to stay in so that she'd be safe. So today, here's a sign along Route 14 coming into Montour Falls that shows the site of Catherinestown. This is Catherine Creek that's running right behind it here. So this is from those journals. Reverend David Kraft is on this journey, and he talks about how they struck their tents at 8 o'clock after 3 miles to pass through an open plain. Then they hit the swamp. And he talks about how terrible it was. And finally, it's getting dark, they started to run into Chihuahua, or French Catherinestown. So they hear all these dogs barking, but they find the place pretty much empty. Here's the old woman that they found. Like I said, they tried to put her on a horse, but she was just too old to go, so they did take care of her. Today, there's a trail called the Catherine Valley Trail. It's an old railroad bed and turned into a hiking, biking trail. And you take a little side trail off that trail, and it takes you over to the site of Catherinestown. And there's a little monument there to Queen Catherine. Some people think this is her burial spot. It's not. It's just a memorial stone to her. And you'll find this over there, along with this turtle mound that was built by an actual Seneca Indian to commemorate Catherinestown and Queen Catherine. And right here at the head of the turtle is that little memorial stone. This also is the site of Catherinestown. This is the hill where Catherine's house was. This is the athletic fields to B.C. Cate Elementary School in Montour Falls today. But this was all the Indian village at one time. Now we always learned in school that the Iroquois lived in long houses. And at one time they did. At the time of the Revolution, they lived in these. They aren't living in long houses anymore. They're living in basically log cabins. So this is one that's at Letchworth Park Council House, but this is pretty much what the soldiers described that they're finding as they come into these towns. They're finding these cabins like this. And at Montour Falls, at Catherinestown, there were 30, 40 houses like that. Their next stop is they go up along the east side of Seneca Lake, and they run into Appletown, also known as Kendaya. And there's 20 houses there, a lot of fruit trees, and that's why I got the name Appletown. And again, here's a drawing that a soldier made right in his journal of the kind of houses they're finding that these Indians are living in, and the ones that they're burning and destroying. They're not living in long houses anymore. This was a burial monument that some Native American was buried in. These guys desecrated a lot of these and opened them up and took out souvenirs to take home with them. But here at Appletown, they found this guy, Luke Swetland, who'd been captured after the Battle of Wyoming. He was brought back through Chemung, Catherinestown, all the way to Appletown. He was adopted into an Indian family to replace somebody who'd been killed in that family. And he was kind of given to this old woman, and he worked for her, and she took care of him. And he talks about this in a journal that he wrote, and he actually was taken pretty good care of by the Native Americans. But he's very, very hungry. There's not a lot of food, not for them and not for him. So he tried to run away about 5 times, but had to come back every time because he was too hungry, he was starving, he was too weak to do it. So when the army comes into Appletown, they find Luke Swetland. He's got just some rags on, he's got the long beard, and when they first capture him, they think that he's a Tory, and they're really, really rough with him. And they're pushing him, shoving him, kicking him, and pulling his clothes off. He gets back to camp, and someone says, "Is that you, Sweatland?" And he almost burst into tears because he was so glad that someone finally recognized him, who he was. And they were amazed that this guy had survived this. And now he's going to go with the Army and get returned. Sweatland went back to Wyoming, Pennsylvania. His family went back to Connecticut because they thought he was dead. He goes all the way back to Connecticut, gets his family, brings him back to Wyoming, Pennsylvania, and settles there again. And some of his descendants still live there today. And he's buried there in the Wyoming cemetery. There's a good-looking tourist standing next to his grave. But he wrote this journal, and it's really interesting reading it. He talks about how he was treated and the stuff that happened to him. It's really interesting reading. And some of the stuff he had to eat was pretty nasty, but that's what they ate. This is a little parking area. This is the site of Kendia, or Appletown, where they found Luke Sweatland. Today it's a little picnic area along Route 414, heading north towards Geneva out of Watkins Glen. This is just a close-up of that sign. Their next stop was Geneva, and Sweatland warned them that they may be setting a trap for them up there and to be careful. So they were very cautious in approaching Geneva, but when they finally got there, they found it too was empty. And this sign today is right next to a gas station in Geneva, marking the site of Canada Saga, which was Geneva. And the only person they found in the village was a 3-year-old boy, a white child, who got left behind. And all he could say is, "My mammy is gone." That's the only English he could say. And one of the soldiers in Sullivan's army adopted this young man. His name was Thomas Macon. And he sent him back home to be raised. But unfortunately, about 3 years later, the boy died of smallpox. Red Jacket was with the Native Americans and the Tories in retreating from Sullivan's army. And near Geneva, Red Jacket and a friend decided they would go out and scout ahead and see where Sullivan's army was. And they went out there, and on this journey, Red Jacket killed a cow with his hatchet. When he got back to the regular group, he told them, "Yeah, I killed an American, killed one of the enemies." But his companion couldn't keep the secret, and he let it out of the bag. It actually was just cow's blood. And John Butler then began to refer to Red Jacket as cow killer. Red Jacket was a famous orator, a famous speaker, not much of a warrior. At the Battle of Newtown, he was one of the first ones that started to run when the shooting happened, and he didn't stop running when he got to Catherinestown. And then this happened. So he was not much of a fighter, but he was very good in speaking. The next stop is Canandaigua Lake, and they get there and destroy that town as well. Just before they invaded the town, Sullivan was angry because some of the guys decided to help themselves with some of the bounties in the Indian fields, and they were putting pumpkins on their bayonets, on their guns. And he got mad when he saw them. He said, "What, are you guys here to get pumpkins or to fight the enemy?" And they all embarrassedly dropped all their pumpkins when he yelled at them. But they go into Cayuga and they find no one again. On an island in Cayuga Lake called Squaw Island, the story is that some Native American women and children fled out to that island and hid there and were never discovered by Sullivan and his men. And you can still see that island in Canandaigua Lake today, but it's very, very much smaller than it was back then. In Canandaigua, there's a monument to the Sullivan campaign. It's on this very sharp curve in the road. It used to be closer to the road, but they moved it because people kept hitting it. They'd come around that curve and bang, right into this memorial. So they finally moved it back off the road a little bit because it kept getting knocked over all the time. When they get past Canandaigua Lake, they get over a little bit further near Geneseo, and this thing happens called the Boyd tragedy. They didn't know where Geneseo was. So at Canisius Lake, there's an inlet that they had to cross, and the Butler had burned the bridge. They had to stop and rebuild the bridge to get the army across it. So while they're doing that, they sent this guy out, Thomas Boyd, who volunteered to take a few men to go scout out and try to spot where the village is, because no white men really have traveled in this area before. They don't know where they're going. They don't know where this village is. So they want someone to go ahead and reconnoiter and find out where it is. So you're supposed to take 2 or 3 riflemen, a guide, and a knighted chief to scout ahead. Well, Boyd goes beyond his orders and takes 26 men for the mission. He was so excited that he was getting to lead a mission that he kind of went overboard and took too many men with him. So, unknown to Boyd, Butler and Brant were planning an ambush. That's one reason they burned the bridge here at the inlet. Because on a little hill up the road, there's a little hill right here, they were waiting in ambush for Sullivan. They were hoping to surprise him, inflict some injuries on him again, and then run away. Well, somehow, because it was still dark out when Boyd set out, he goes right past them and never gets detected. They keep on going, and they eventually come to a village over here. So Boyd and his men, this is where the ambush was supposed to happen. They come through here, they find this abandoned Indian village over here, and while they're there, 2 Indian men come into the village while they're watching. And there was a guy named Tim Murphy who was with him. He's up in the tree in this painting. Murphy was a kind of famous frontiersman. It was said that he was the one who picked off General Fraser at the Battle of Saratoga, which helped turn the tide of that battle and helped the Americans win a victory. It's not sure whether or not he actually did this. In fact, his widow later said that he didn't do it. But everybody else said that Tim Murphy picked off General Fraser at Saratoga. Well, Murphy's on this journey. And when these 2 men come into the village, he shoots one of them and kills him. And he was kind of an elderly man who he killed. And the other one gets away, gets on a horse and takes off. Well, they quickly run up and they scalp the man that they killed. And they give the scalp to Hanyeri, the Oneida guy who's with them. He's a Native American. He's Oneida. He's got this scalp in his belt. He's going to get captured with that scalp hanging off of his belt. As they're coming back, they run into this ambush. This time they get detected. And he's only got like 26 men with him. There's about 400 men sitting here waiting for him. And they push him up onto this little hill right here, which is next to a farmer's field here of corn. But if you go out there, it's the middle of nowhere. If you go up this little dirt road just past Canisius Lake, you'll find this little hill and these wooden steps up to a monument. And this is where Boyd and his men met their fate. So there's a monument there in that field to Thomas Boyd and his men who were killed, except Boyd and Sergeant Parker and Hanyeri, the Oneida, were captured. The others were either killed or they ran off, including Tim Murphy. He was able to escape. But Hanyeri was killed right away. His brother was there on the enemy's side, talking to him, telling him he shouldn't be fighting with them. And he said, well, I won't kill you because I'm your brother. But another Indian standing next to his tomahawk and dashed his head and killed him right there at the spot. Boyd and Parker were taken back to the village of Geneseo and were horribly tortured to death. A lot of their soldier mates here were killed and buried on this knoll. Boyd and Parker were horribly tortured. I mean, they did some terrible things to them, and some of the stuff they did are pretty ghastly. They were buried in a mound along the creek right there in Cuylerville, New York, near Geneseo. And later on, in 1841, their bodies were exhumed and they were moved to Hope Cemetery, Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, New York. Here's their burial site today. Unfortunately, when they dug them up in 1841, they took them by the Genesee Valley Canal up to Rochester in this big fanfare. Didn't have the money to create this burial site. Their bodies sat there for a few years, just out in the open, in the air. And, their caskets and stuff were just rotting away. And they finally got buried, and now they have this nice stone over their burial site. And this is what it says in the stone. So Boyd and Parker and Hanyeri are buried there, and some of the other men have been moved here as well. So here's their burial sites near the stone.
Was it, you said the Indian was buried there, was his name on the monument? I didn't have time to read that.
Oh, I don't recall if it was. Might not have been. Yeah, I don't see it. Oh yeah, here it is. They spelled it differently. It looks like Knockberry. This is Mary Jemison. She was known as the White Woman of Seneca. She was captured near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania at the time of the French and Indian War, brought all the way up to Geneseo and adopted into the Indian tribe. And she stayed there and outlived a few husbands. And this was her village, Geneseo, that they destroyed. She wasn't there, but she describes how terrible the destruction was after it was over. This is the marker near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, that talks about her capture in 1758 and how she was brought back up to Geneseo. Geneseo was the largest village the Army had encountered. 128 houses. They burned them all, burned 15,000 bushels of corn, they estimated. And he told them here that, I think we've gone far enough, let's turn around and go back home. So the idea of trying to capture Fort Niagara is dropped, and they're just going to turn around and retrace their steps and head home. Before they left, a white woman suddenly appeared into their camp, carrying a 2-year-old child. She was another victim of the Wyoming Valley raids. Her husband was killed by Seneca raiding party, and she was taken prisoner. She later married one of Sullivan's men, Roswell Franklin, one of the first settlers in Cayuga County after the war was over. This is the village of Geneseo. There's a big marker here today. There's this huge tree. It was probably there at the time. The tree that's called the torture tree that Parker and Boyd were tied to and tortured to death. That's probably not it, but that tree was probably a little sapling at the time that it happened, and it's still there today. It's just a gigantic tree. This is the site of the original Boyd Parker burial in Cuylerville, New York. You can see that people still put things there. There's feathers stuck in the ground. And this is what's on the stone. But like I said, they've been moved since then to Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester. The Native Americans fled to Fort Niagara to get away from Sullivan Clinton's army. And they're going to spend a very horrible winter there. They're going to encamp outside the fort. The British are going to have to try to supply them with clothing and blankets and food. Smallpox breaks out. That winter of 1779 and 1780 was one of the worst winters you can imagine. This is when the United States and other areas are undergoing what's part of what's called the Little Ice Age. Very, very cold winters. They had 5 feet of snow that stood on the ground in much of western New York all winter long. Even animals got stuck in it and froze to death. And this is what they have to deal with. They're trying to live outside in tents and makeshift shelters outside this fort in that kind of a winter. This is a drawing of Fort Niagara in 1796, so it probably looks something like this at the time of Sullivan Clinton's campaign. On the return, the army divides up, and they decide to hit some other Indian villages along Cayuga Lake. So they're going to go down both sides of Cayuga Lake and destroy more villages. Some of the army is going to go along the north end of the lakes here and head back towards the Mohawk Valley. Up to this time, the Cayugas really hadn't been made to suffer very much, but Sullivan decides that their villages are going to have to be destroyed as well. And, like I said, Peter Gansevoort led a detachment to the Mohawk Valley along the north end of the lakes. Again, another atrocity. Along Cayuga Lake, Colonel Henry Dearborn and his men are destroying some Cayuga villages. In one village, they found a small village. They found 3 Indian women and a young crippled boy hiding in fear. 2 younger women were taken prisoner, but the elderly woman and the crippled boy were locked up inside one of the huts and burned alive.
Oh.
So these guys were not in a very good mood after what they saw happen to Boyd and Parker. They did some pretty vicious things like this. When they get back to Horseheads, as they're retracing their path, a lot of their pack horses are worn out. So they destroy the horses. And later on, when the first white settlers came in the valley in 1780, they found the bleached skulls of the horses' heads lined up along the path leading towards Catherinestown in Seneca Lake. And that's why Horseheads gets its name, Horseheads. Most people think that's a pretty strange name, but where it came from. Today, in front of the Horseheads Village Hall is this monument to a pack horse. So there's this nice looking statue in front of the village hall. And this is what gave Horseheads its name, the death of these pack horses. Back at Elmira, Sullivan Clinton had left some men at Kenowa Hollow to set up a fort there and store up supplies. So when they came back, they could have some food. And when they got back there, they celebrated. They had what's called a feu de joie. They had all the men line up facing each other, and Sullivan rode his white horse down between them as they fired off their guns in a salute. And they had an oxen roast, and they had alcohol, and they're drinking because they're celebrating because they just learned that Spain had decided to enter on the side of the Americans, the American Revolution. General Edward Hand here had a little bit too much to drink, and he led them in a very rousing version of an Indian war dance. He was prancing around like a crazy man, and everybody thought it was pretty funny. He was just totally drunk. They demolished the fort and set out for Tioga and Fort Sullivan. When they arrived there, they're greeted with a 13-gun salute. There's more celebrations. Fort Sullivan then is torn down, and they head back to eastern Pennsylvania. This is along Water Street in Elmira. This is the marker that shows where Sullivan's army encamped. This is where Fort Reed was, where Edward Hand did his crazy dancing. Some of the results of the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. Sullivan estimated they destroyed about 32 towns, that they destroyed about 160,000 bushels of corn, along with many fruit trees that had been destroyed. They just girdled the trees. They took axes and chopped around the base of them to kill the trees. About 40 men had been lost in the campaign, and 5,000 refugees went pouring into Fort Niagara for the British to take care of. One author called the Sullivan-Clinton campaign a well-executed failure. He said Fort Niagara had not been captured. They abandoned Fort Reed and Fort Tioga and went back, leaving Fort Stanley as the only really fort on the frontier in New York State. It did not stop the attacks on the frontier, which was true. In 1780, they were worse, not better. Sullivan failed to cut off the enemy at Newtown and allowed Brant and Butler to escape, and he moved too slowly and too cautiously. Now, this last thing here, I mentioned how Sullivan was very slow, but actually in the long run, it kind of paid off. Because he was so slow, he's not attacking these Indian villages until August and September, just as their crops are coming ripe. And he's destroying them. They have no chance to replant and grow anything else. So those Native Americans are going to be stuck in the winter with no food. And the British are going to have to supply them with everything they need. So in that sense, it was good for Sullivan, from his perspective, to be so slow, because it made it impossible for the Native Americans to replace that food. Sullivan resigns from the army, I should say 1779, not 1799. He leaves the army, returned to New Hampshire, served in Congress, the Attorney General of New Hampshire. He was elected governor of New Hampshire and served 2 terms. When he died in 1795, he was a U.S. district judge, but he also was very deeply in debt. Now, in those days, the rule was that if you were in debt and you died, that your relatives and children and so on had to make sure that your debts were taken care of before you could be buried. So, his friend Joseph Silly is said to have walked his coffin to the grave with a pistol in his hand to make sure that Sullivan got buried without having to go through this, because he thought it was too embarrassing for his friend. His friend deserved a decent burial, and he was going to see to it he got it, and he did. Here's Joseph Silly, right there. He's the one with a pistol making sure he got buried. Clinton goes back to Albany, continues to serve in the war. He's at Yorktown when the British surrendered to Washington to end the war. And after the war, he served at some posts, but mainly was retired. He did serve in the New York Convention that ratified the Constitution, got elected to the state Senate. He died at his home in 1812. And like I said, his son, DeWitt Clinton, would be the guy who builds the Erie Canal. Joseph Brant, like many Mohawks, leave the United States. He goes to Canada and lives in Ontario. He had a large home there. He gave his children good educations. He'll die in 1807 at Grand River, Ontario. One of his sons was a very bad alcoholic. And he and that son got in a very vicious fight one day. And Brant grabbed a tomahawk and killed him. Killed his own son because he was just in this drunken rage. Butler leaves his large estate in the Mohawk Valley, which today is a private home, and goes to Canada. He continues to work as a deputy superintendent for the Indian Department, and he dies in Niagara, Canada on May 12, 1796. After the war, some of the land that Sullivan Clinton's army marched through is given to as a military tract, and these counties are formed out of it, but this land was used to give to Continental soldiers as payment for their service in the war. In 1788, Treaty of Buffalo Creek, Phelps and Gorham bought over 2 million acres of land in Western Europe for $5,000. And this is the Phelps and Gorham purchase right here. And they later sold this off in lots to settlers. And you see the military tract here. There was a reservation for the Onondaga up near Syracuse. They still have that today. The Oneida had a reservation as well, which you see in the map here also. The Cayuga had a reservation, which is no longer there. They forfeited that reservation and went west eventually. And the Watkins and Flint purchased south of Seneca Lake here as well. Now, at the end of the war, the British could have agreed that this was the United States. I mean, this very conceivably could have been the land that they gave to the United States. So here you go, this is what you won as a result of the war. Instead, they give them this. From the Great Lakes to Florida to the Mississippi River, this becomes the United States. And that was good for the United States. It was bad for the Native Americans. Basically, the British abandoned the Native Americans at the end of the war and turned over all this land to the United States. And now suddenly all these Native American nations find themselves having to deal with the United States and not the British. British just abandoned them.
You have it on the map, but you should note that a treaty line in the Treaty of Paris of 1763, that was supposed to be perpetual Indian reserve to the west.
Yeah, but they,
Well, it's only 20 years before.
yeah, they never did it. I mean, the whites just kept encroaching in Indian land, kept encroaching and encroaching, kept taking all the time. Even this line they disobeyed. They were pushing into Kentucky already before the revolution even started. So Indian land was just being desecrated by the whites moving in there. Here's two books about the Sullivan Clinton campaign. One by Max Mintz, this one by Barbara Graymont. This is what Mintz says in his. He basically implies that the Sullivan Clinton campaign kind of conquered Western New York for the United States. And he says that this was about sowing the seeds of empire. Barbara Graymont disagrees and says it didn't really conquer anything. She talks about how they failed to break Indian power. The attacks on the western frontier got worse in 1780, not better. The Americans could not conquer the Iroquois. They could neither hold the territory they invaded nor bring the Indians to terms. And they didn't conquer anything. They burned Fort Sullivan. They destroyed Fort Reed. They went back to eastern Pennsylvania. They didn't occupy any of this territory. So they didn't conquer anything. The power of the Iroquois was never broken until the British abandoned them at the end of the war. The Indians could still fight as long as the British were there to help back them up. Once the British leave, they're stuck. Their villages have been destroyed. They have nobody who's willing to give them food and gunpowder and shot. They're stuck having to deal with the Americans now because they're in American territory. And but even so, the American government was not strong enough to really compel the Iroquois to do much. They had to negotiate through treaties to get what they wanted. Here's another book, The Glorious Cause by Robert Middlecoff, a well-known book about the American Revolution. Not one word in there about Sullivan Clinton. Not one. Not even mentioned. This is the biggest military operation of the war, not even mentioned in the book. Here's one sentence. They get one sentence in this book. He basically says it was a useless operation. Why is the Sullivan Clinton campaign so overlooked by historians? One, it did very little to change the outcome of the war. If the purpose was to stop the Indian raids, it did do it. Like I said, they got worse in 1780. They couldn't wait to get back on the warpath and start destroying towns again and farms again because of what happened in the Sullivan Clinton campaign. I heard one person describe the Sullivan Clinton campaign as one of the big turning points of the war. As big as Saratoga. Nonsense. I think that's a bunch of nonsense. It is not a turning point. To me, a turning point is something that, because it happened, things changed in the war. What changed in the revolution because of the Sullivan Clinton campaign? Nothing. I think if you take the Sullivan Clinton campaign away, the revolution still ends the same way that it did. You couldn't say that if you took Saratoga away or Yorktown away. Now, I don't think the Sullivan Clinton campaign is a turning point at all. It did not conquer any territory. Like I said, they left those forts and went back east. They didn't occupy this land. It did not stop the attacks on the frontier by the Native Americans. did have a tremendous impact on the Native Americans. For them, this is a turning point. This was huge for them. Their towns have been destroyed. And everything's been wiped out. And then the British abandoned them. They're stuck having to negotiate with their former enemies, the Americans, for everything they need. The Americans can say, well, we'll give you that if you give us this. And that's going to force them to give up their land over time. And this brings us to the end. And thanks for coming tonight. And are there any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Not a question, but a comment. When I first moved to this area, I stumbled upon Alan Eckert's
Oh, yes.
historical novels
Right.
and talked about graphic descriptions.
Yeah, I'm glad you called them novels, though. I had somebody go tell me, oh, have you ever read Alan Eckert? It's great history. It's not history at all.
Novels, yeah.
Because he makes up all the dialogue in those books.
Yeah.
It's not historical, but people think that it's history, and it's